Should books have a spice rating? Hey y'all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandy Broadwell, and today we're gonna get into the weeds. This question is not gonna come up with an answer. We're just gonna start a conversation and hopefully we can engage civilly in the comments about it. So for context, when I talk about spice is what some people use to refer to as like smut or like sexiness in a book. A lot of influencers will use like a little like spicy pepper rating when they're talking about it on like their TikToks or even YouTube channels. And you know, like the more peppers it has, the spicier it is or the smuttier it is. And I actually got inspiration from this because this question was recently briefly discussed in a video by Leandra, the TBR0, who has an awesome channel that I absolutely love. So I would highly recommend going to watch her video, which I will link down below. And that video was just one where readers were submitting their own kind of takes and questions and Leandra was responding to them. But the one that really sent me down the rabbit hole was this books having a spice rating conundrum. Now, am I qualified to talk about this? Probably not. I'm not even a romance reader. I don't even really read romantasy. I'm a fantasy sci-fi girly. But I just kept thinking about this after watching that video, and so I did a whole deep dive. So I'm gonna be looking down a lot because I have a lot of notes on this topic, and we're just gonna go all the way in the weeds. Let's go together. So the first thing that kind of came to mind to me is like, if books were given a spice rating, who would be the one to give that rating? Would it be the author? Would it be the publisher? Would every publisher have a different rating if that was the case? It should obviously be some sort of like impartial third party, but like who is an impartial third party in a bookish space? There's like libraries, but librarians are already super overwhelmed and underfunded, so it's not them. And then I was thinking like, maybe booksellers, but like, how would you feel if Amazon was the one that rated your books? That would be horrible. And that has a huge implication potentially on the sales of those books. So it definitely shouldn't be booksellers. And then like in that whole discussion too, like what about self-published authors? Would they even qualify for a rating system if one existed? Or would it just be like traditionally published books that have to meet those requirements? And then I think the thornier issue here in talking about like whether books should have spice ratings is, why would we rate for spice but not for violence and other content? Or is just the fact that like there's an adult section when you walk into a bookstore or a library and there's a young adult and there's a children's section, is that enough? Or do we need to further split this out into ratings? And frankly, if we did give books ratings, not just for spice, but also for, you know, language and violence and all these other things that visual media is usually given ratings for, would that make it easier to ban books? Book banning is so big in the United States right now, and it's horrifying and scary. And frankly, the things that people want to ban books for is ridiculous. And there's tons of visual media that kids have access to all the time that don't have to deal with the same banning that's going on with books. So I don't want to give book banning happy people another tool to more easily do that thing. The closest thing we have to book ratings in our current world, other than of course like there's the adult section of books, is that sometimes self-selecting authors will choose to put content warnings like in the front page or two of their book if there is something that could be potentially really triggering or harmful for a group of people. For instance, if there's some sort of essay or something like that involved. As far as I know, people don't do that for spice because I'm sure they don't want to scare away any readers who might find out that they actually enjoy the content of the book. I could be wrong, again, because I'm not a person who normally reads books that have that sort of content. But I do understand where people are coming from when they talk about wanting these sort of ratings, because I do remember reading She Who Became the Sun, which was a fine read. I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. It was just It was fine. But I do remember being like taken aback during the reading experience when suddenly there was like a fisting scene. And I, that just seemed to come out of left field. And I was just like, wow, that got graphic very quickly. Okay, this is here now. And personally, like, I don't love that, but also like it was just one scene. It is what it is. I moved on. It didn't turn me off from reading the book, and it didn't really affect my rating of the book because my enjoyment of the book was not based on that scene. So the rabbit hole that I got into when thinking about all of these things was, how did movie ratings come about? And why do visual mediums like movies and video games have a rating system, but things like books don't? And also, why are video game ratings different than movie ratings? So this is the rabbit hole we're going into together. I did a bunch of research, and here's what I've learned. So movie ratings started out in the year 1930 with something called the Hays Code. And it wasn't actually a real rating system, it was a moral censorship guideline. It included prohibitions on things like interracial marriage, ridicule of the clergy, and white slavery. Now, mind you, not other forms of slavery, just white slavery. Lord have mercy. But these were actual, like, these things could not appear in films that were produced. That's what the Hays Code was. It was censorship, not ratings. Then in 1952, the Supreme Court ruled that motion pictures are a form of expression protected by the First Amendment. That significantly weakened the Hays Code, which was already starting to fall out of fashion. But it wasn't until 1968 that the Motion Picture Association president developed an innovative movie rating system that allowed parents to make informed decisions about whether a film was appropriate for their family. So movie ratings have never been about telling the viewer what to expect. It's about telling parents whether this film is appropriate for their children, which I think is an important distinction. So at the time, movies were rated either G, M, R, or X. And M later was changed to PG. In 1984, PG-13 was added as a new classification, and in 1990, NC-17 replaced X. And at that time, rating descriptors were also added to give more information about the elements of the film that gave it that rating. So I'm sure we're all familiar with what these ratings mean. They're very widely known and accepted in our culture, but just in case you're unfamiliar, G means general audience, basically acceptable to anyone. PG is parental guidance suggested. PG-13 means parents strongly cautioned. R means restricted. And in this case, children going to the movie theater must have supervision of an adult or a parent. And NC-17 means no one under 17 will be admitted whether they have a parent or an adult supervisor or not. And important to note, which I'm quoting directly from the ratings website, NC-17 does not mean obscene or pornographic in the common or legal meaning of those words and should not be construed as a negative judgment in any sense. The rating simply signals that the content is appropriate only for an adult audience. I think this is interesting because I definitely thought of like NC-17 or X being like, whoa, that's like really bad. But I don't, it's interesting to actually like read what the ratings mean and see like how my perception of those is maybe a little bit different than what the description actually says. And then the only other thing along the historical timeline that I thought was interesting or of note was in 2007, smoking was added as a factor in the film rating process. And so that is something that now movie raters take into consideration when they're rating whether a film is appropriate for a child audience. So again, none of these things talk about like level of spice, right? So it is interesting to think about that. So when thinking about the rating classifications, the website says, in rating a motion picture, the rating board evaluates each motion picture in its entirety and considers those aspects of the motion picture that most parents would consider in determining whether that motion picture is suitable for viewing by their children, including mature themes, language, depictions of violence, nudity, sensuality, depictions of sexual activity, adult activities, i.e. activities that adults but not minors may engage in legally, and drug use. And then I also thought it was interesting to see who makes up the rating board, like who makes these decisions. It's the Motion Picture Association, but on the rating board itself it says each member of the rating board must be a parent and may not have any other affiliation with the entertainment industry. The chairperson and senior raters may have children of any age. Raters must have children between the ages of 5 and 15 when they joined the rating board and must leave the rating board when all of their children have reached the age of 21. And basically this rating board rates any film of any length that's not considered to be an advertisement. If it has been exhibited, which means made commercially available for screening publicly, or distributed, which means made commercially available to the public for home use. And all motion pictures that are intended for either commercial public viewing or commercial home viewing must be submitted to this ratings board. So I found all of that really fascinating. And again, this raises the question for me of like, well, who would do this for books? Not that there's not a ton of films, but there's like millions of books published every year. And like, who has to read all of these? That'd be crazy. That'd be a lot, especially when you consider self-published books in that category as well. So then I went to video games to figure out like, how did video game ratings start and why is that different than motion picture ratings? Video games are rated by the Entertainment Software Rating Board, which began in 1994, and their ratings started as EC, which meant early childhood, K to A, which meant kids to adults, T for teen, M for mature, and AO, which meant adults only. Then in 1998, they changed K to A to E for everyone. And in 2005, an E10 plus rating was introduced, which I assume is similar to like a PG-13. And then they have two different processes for rating games based on whether the games are available physically or only digitally. So for physical games, there is a questionnaire that's filled out by the developer and a video of the gameplay is submitted. The video is reviewed by 3 trained raters who submit a rating for review. After that review has been approved, test players will verify the disclosure of the gameplay is accurate. I know this is getting like way down in there, but I found all of this interesting, so maybe some of you will too. For digital games, there's again a questionnaire filled out by the developer, which auto-assigns the rating. There's no rating summaries available to the public through this process, and then it's tested upon release and adjustments can be made promptly if necessary. And that was launched in 2012 as a cost-free rating system for the developers. For video games, there are actually 30 different content descriptors that will contribute to a video game's rating. So I plucked out all of the ones that had to do with spice. And so for video game spice, the content descriptors that contribute to a rating are suggestive themes, partial nudity, sexual content, sexual themes, and sexual violence. So that's all of the movie and video game content that I researched, but I will link the two rating websites for both in video games down below, which is where I got all this super helpful information. With these ratings, again, there's nothing about level of spice, right? I mean, you can assume that something that includes partial nudity probably has less spice than something that has full nudity, or that sexual themes are going to be different than sexual content. But still, I don't think that gets at what someone who's asking for books to be rated for spice is trying to get at. There is this concept that's talked a lot about among romance readers about closed door versus open door spice, or smut, if you will. And closed door is kind of like when things start to get heated among the characters, there's like a fade to black, and it's just completely left up to the reader's imagination. Whereas open door is essentially, you see it all, you hear it all, you're there for the moment. But I've also heard some romance readers say that there's a big difference between like open door lights off content or open door lights on content. And it's easy for me to imagine like what that sort of thing could mean. And there's definitely like different comfort levels or different levels of what someone is looking for, I'm sure, when they get into romance or smut content, where I assume like an open door lights off sort of scene might include like a tasteful scene that characterizes characters' intimacy without describing particular acts or body parts. Whereas open door lights on is very much like you're getting in there with the characters. You're hearing the sounds. Nothing left to the imagination. There's also, I know some people, when individually putting up their like little spicy peppers for how spicy something is in a book, some people consider also the amount of like steamy scenes in a novel, whereas like maybe there's only one steamy scene but it is open door lights on. How would you rate that versus a book that maybe has like 5 different steamy scenes but they're all closed door fade to black? And is that even considered steamy? Again, there's so much subjectivity to this sort of thing. But I think that some people really want explicit content and some people don't. But there is a difference between explicit content in a romance novel or a romantasy sort of novel versus full-on erotica. And I think, that's one of those things, famously, like the quote about pornography, it's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. So that's really all of the main things I wanted to chat about today. Again, I don't have answers to these questions. I personally don't think that books should have a spice rating. I think that should be left up to the author to decide whether that's something that they want on their book or not. And I also just generally don't think that books should have content ratings at all, because I think that's what the adult section in the bookstore is for. You can assume there's going to be some adult content. Now, I can understand that some people who want to shy away from certain things would be better off like knowing those things before they get into a book. And I've heard a lot of romance readers complain about how the popularity of these like cartoon romance covers versus these like steamier romance covers is often very misleading. So the popularity of the cartoon covers has meant that more and more books have this sort of cover regardless of how innocent or steamy or smutty they actually are on the inside. And I think that could be like a good sort of distinguishing factor maybe of like if romance books that have like a lot of smut had a book cover that indicated to the reader that that's what they were getting into, versus people who don't want that in a book could have a more innocent looking cover. Again, I'm not proposing this. I'm just saying like those sort of things do help readers find the books that they're looking for, which I think also helps books have higher ratings if the people who are looking for your content find your content. But again, I don't think that there necessarily should be any formal sort of way that this is enforced. I think it is good that influencers like are taking up this space to try and figure out these things so that they can pitch the books to their readers and watchers who want to know that sort of content warning. But I would love to hear your thoughts about book spice ratings down in the comments below. Do you think this is something that books should have? And if so, how would you propose going about it? What do you think should be the way that books are rated? Who do you think should be responsible for it? And how would you determine what the levels of spice mean? So anyway, that's it for me today. Thanks so much for hanging out and tuning in. I know this was pretty out there for my regular content, but it was a fun little thought experiment for me. So hopefully you enjoyed it as well. Thanks so much for tuning in. As always, please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button down below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you again soon.